suppose you could go back to the subject for today, which is innovation. And what do you think, Raphael? My own dealings with many different sorts of local authorities and government, right up to government ministers, as soon as you say the word innovation and quality, they actually want to talk to you. You have to put something on the table. Because they've heard those words from a lot of people.
Yeah.
So
well,
there has to be something, I don't mean concrete in that sense, but something actually to talk about.
I think it's really important with innovation first to say that it's not, it's often thought as, what's going to be the technical solution, technology solution to something, and it's not about that. I mean, technology obviously has a part to play, but it is... It's
creativity.
It's creativity, and it's actually so often comes from connecting people that are from different disciplines, different backgrounds, different sectors together to come up with different perspectives on different solutions. And I think, so this is why who's around the table. I think, if it does contain different... Manchester is a great city for stakeholders. There are great mechanisms in which stakeholders come together and they work together, and it has been very, very successful. But, I think as Stefan was pointing out, there are also many people who are actually outside of the charmed circle. And we need maybe to develop a new stakeholder model, and then through that we need to innovate. We need to have new things happen. I think it's very interesting, and I think it actually comes back to what we were talking about earlier, which is to have that network that you've got a kind of nascent, emerging network that you've got, and connecting it up with a way in which you can actually ask it questions. The question is, I've got this project that I want to consult people on, or the question is, this is a problem that we have as a city, in terms of service design. It could be lots of different types of things. There could be something there that sounds
very quick example with the project we're teaching a research methods course. We've got a small commission from a housing group, and the thing that we've done is we've connected a co-housing group that one of our PhD students have been working with for the last 3 years with a registered housing provider. First session with the students, they're all doing a feasibility study, and suddenly you realise, all right, well, we don't have to have 45 parking spaces because it's a co-house. So we'll be able to argue, genuinely argue that you shouldn't have 45 parking spaces. So that's a third extra site area to develop immediately. And suddenly the economic development of that extra care scheme becomes feasible again. So just bringing two partners together that wouldn't normally be in the room can be really creative because it changes the conditions in which you're acting.
Yeah. There's another thing about your network though, which is that if we say, okay, we use that as the network that we're going to ask questions of, that's why I said at the beginning, what's the demographic of that? It represents, how representative a slice is it of Manchester to ask questions of. So it may be also a question of saying, well, we have that, it's essentially community group based, so that's how it started. But we can also look at how that network can be developed into different permutations of network to ask different questions of.
That one of the most interesting projects is the dealing with gentrification, which Lucy came up with.
Yes.
Because it is a major problem.
Big challenge.
It's a huge, huge challenge.
I agree.
And I don't know that anybody really nailed that one.
This gentrification is one of the questions that you should be able to interrogate this network about in a way, because we can have our view as the design community, and as I say, my view is how can you keep new artists coming into it? But your point is you're displacing communities, which is a really important.
I don't think artists are displacing communities usually. The artists are moving where there's cheap rent and there's opportunity for them. The problem is then they get displaced, or lower socioeconomic groups in residential areas get displaced because the place becomes attractive to higher socioeconomic groups. And actually that kind of kills the city in a sense as well. The actual character that developed through those communities is displaced. So it defeats all of us on every level, really. And there's no clear answer to how we do this stuff, how we improve a place without causing that.
And which is to think about the inclusive city and the inclusive community. I think so much development of this kind has been driven by sort of Richard Florida creative thinking, which has been building citadels, and then everybody outside the city, so everything becomes very rich in one area, and outside it becomes is very poor. Whereas now we're really thinking of trying to connect to all parts of the community more. So I don't know to what extent you can keep it sustainable if we make the whole of Greater Manchester very rich.
Well, Manchester City Council, to its credit, has tried pretty hard to deal with that issue by developing using its own pension fund to become a developer. You know, because you ask the housing team what levers they have to change that, and they have very little. You know, they can't demand anything of private developers anymore, even the Section 106. So, but they've invested a huge amount of money in trying to change that dynamic a little bit. But the spatial frame, the GM spatial framework, I think, is probably the point where we should be looking to try and think about these issues, because it's about this. It's not something we've mentioned specifically, but when we're looking at the housing capacity of different areas, and you're looking at that in terms of the economic model as well. And so a housing provider might be looking at trying to persuade people to downsize because it's got lots of 3-bedroom properties. But at the city level, we've got to move beyond just counting the numbers of older people that we think will be in that class group and need an extra care place, but actually look at the whole capacity to house people and how we want to structure neighbourhoods so that they're mixed. So you get the city centre is not at all a mixed neighbourhood, and most of the complaints about antisocial behaviour because it's just a place to go out to and commute into.
Well, it's the challenge of designing to create latency and inhabit that latent condition, whatever it is. The kind of classical design approach is trying to squeeze that out and maximise the value of whatever you're being asked to look at, isn't it? Which has a tendency to push to the edges of something. And one of the kind of challenges, I guess, is how we decide collectively that should be done. Are there overarching kind of citywide agendas towards the creation of ambiguity and space that could be used in non-standard ways? It's interesting. Northern Quarter, it's a bit of a dump, really, isn't it? And yet somehow it's become a creative hotbed. There's a sort of resistance to these places. It's like Old Street, crikey. I wouldn't choose to go there. If I was given the choice of anywhere in London, I would not choose to go to Old Street. Yet somehow it's been successful. And there's this notion of kind of spatial resistance, I think, that's actually quite interesting.
I wonder whether I might pull back to the chair again and suggest that we look at item number 8 on our agenda, which is potential collaborations and projects, which I had a go at listing.
Wow.
But I wonder whether we should go around the table and just get individuals' thoughts, because I asked everybody at the beginning to introduce themselves. Let's start with you, Lucy. Just something that you think would be a project or an idea which you'd like to collaborate on. You don't have to say who with. You could, though.
Okay. I must say, I think probably the best ideas are going to come out after everyone's had a chance to let it all percolate. But as a knee-jerk reaction, although it's not my area, it does sound as if potentially some sort of data sharing is an interesting idea. It's not easy because on every level, if it's private sector, there's client confidentiality. If it's research, then sometimes the external funders actually own the work, so you can't necessarily release it, but there might be something interesting to look at there.
Very good. Rob?
I'd second that, actually. I think what's interesting is that the city models that I've seen and things that appear in various funded things always retract back to some visualization thing. I think it's about the data. I think that's that's the important bit, which will inform how you actually interact or act in the city or whatever the project may be. And I think that there's definitely something there about sort of how it would come about. I don't know how. But an integrated city model that starts to be a receptacle for some of this information to actually make informed decisions for the designer, I think is critical. I think
there's a little project then, an integrated city model.
Well, we've built. I mean, within the master's program that we've done in the last couple of years, we've built the Oxford Road corridor as a 3D model, and then that morphed into something with live data sets being fed into it. So there are things there, but these things need to be validated. They need, some serious research, some serious funding coming into them, and I think that's something which, is an area for the Innovate UKs and the other the research councils maybe to have a look at. From a personal point of view as well, from innovation within architecture, I think that there's a designly side to actually, in terms of changing the culture, in terms of how we're commissioned and how we act in these things at an early level and on an early stage at pre-brief through to feedback loops from post-occupancy, is actually looking into the design of architecture and what that really means as a profession. And for me, in terms of innovation, and this is kind of slightly to the side, designly thinking into an understanding where we extricate a fee from the percentage of the construction cost, when really what we should be looking at is how we extricate a fee over a longer term period on projects, at the building in use and the building in terms of those who use it, because there's huge amounts of value that we bring as a profession that is completely invisible, and we don't even charge on it. So for me, I think there's another area to actually look at designly thinking put forward into the business model, which is quite interesting.
I think most architects would like people to look over fees. That'd be great.
Yeah.
Right, Katie.
Gosh, there's probably a lot of things really that I would like to tackle, and slightly more, sets of data that you hold are really intriguing, and the kind of way that maybe we could tap into that in some way with new clients. We've got a client that's looking at a site at the minute for a very interesting project, which is a client that is actually quite new to the city, and I think that's quite a good opportunity to for somebody that maybe doesn't think they already know the city, to say, hang on a minute, you need to actually do some of this really early stage stuff, and to kind of have a more kind of collaborative approach from the start. That site also happens to sit next to a transport node, so to tap into some of the kind of TFGM thinking as well would be great. I think some of our being on the TFGM framework, we see as a real opportunity, not necessarily to deliver a big piece of infrastructure in station terms, but actually to do some of that kind of work out in the communities. And I think I might have to look into this, but I think as being on that framework, I think we have the opportunity to suggest projects that can be initiated from the lot that we sit within. And so something like that is a possibility.
Patrick.
I guess from the transport perspective, I guess we talked about kind of the difficulties in the procurement. So I would look into maybe the kind of things that Ben's doing and collaborating there and bringing kind of efforts in there where maybe because where we sit contractually, we might not be able to have to adapt to certain situations or as quickly as he may be able to. So I think like collaborative efforts there would actually, sitting on the side of the fence where we are driving the design, and we're they're often the big infrastructure things are engineer led. So we are again a kind of a consultant to the engineer, but actually have kind of more grassroots kind of initiatives would be really interesting to kind of collaborate on those things and bring those to the big and the small projects.
That's great. Thank you.
All these ideas are kind of very much linked, aren't they? And the sort of theme of connections, I still keep coming back to the fact that I think that there are barriers within the way in which we all have to work. Some of them are legal and contractual barriers. And often I found that the most interesting projects, the most interesting outcomes come through innovation simply in the process. So it's not technological innovation necessarily, although I'd echo what Katie said about the work that we're doing. But innovation in terms of being brave about being able to connect all levels of the discussion, because these things are building parts of the city, quarters of the city that hopefully will be successful in the long term. And I think it is really important that we make sure that that's inclusive. And it's interesting there's complete silence around the table, because the issue that you've raised is really a very, very difficult issue to resolve. It's not as though anybody is able to turn down work or fundamentally change a brief, but we can react in ways that are innovative within the scope that we have in terms of design. And we can, through, I think, promoting conversation outside of the design process per se, but just promoting conversation about our city and creating some kind of forum. And I still don't know what the shape of that needs to be going forward, not just in terms of a once a year thing. I think there could be a much more frequent discussion that pulls together a disparate group of people that tries to tackle some of these issues.
Sorry to interrupt you. Shall I leave you to the end?
Yeah, by all means.
No, I'll let you have the last 30 seconds saying that. Michael.
I think probably for what Lucy said, in terms of information sharing and kind of research, it's really, really, really key. I think particularly in kind of understanding where people are coming from, where people want to go to, and overcoming some of those kind of inclusivity issues, I think as well, that's really, really key.
The question of Manchester's personality is quite an interesting kind of prospect. Because obviously, there's an awful amount of international kind of cash that's being invested into the city, into the infrastructure, and it's turning it into a kind of city that has a global presence and a visibility, which is it's quite an interesting kind of proposition. And I think we need to be kind of very responsible at how we deal with that and how we respond to that, and really include that community kind of engagement. And this idea about having an integrated city model, I think, is really important, so we actually understand what it is that we're kind of dealing with and how it is developing, so we can test sort of issues like where the tall buildings are, where the public realm needs to be concentrated, where the external public spaces in the city need to be improved because they're not great. Why can't Manchester be like sort of Copenhagen? But this idea about getting the city working on a kind of a greater Manchester sort of scale is really important, and how the boroughs connect into the city centres is absolutely critical to the success of the boroughs and to the success of the core of the city. And Burnham's got this idea about having a cycle route from each borough into the city centre, which I think is just a fantastic ambition about using high lines and kind of existing infrastructure. It's a really kind of enticing idea.
I like the idea of city bike routes, it's brilliant.
And it's great to get people from the city kind of around the table, and I think that engagement is all about sort of the design community from a variety of different kind of disciplines and backgrounds, engaging with the city on a kind of regular basis.
You've had your minute now.
That's it.
That's it. Actually, I think what's going to come out of this is everybody's going to be going home with stuff buzzing around, and I think we should all write it down and send it back in. Tom,
okay, I'll keep this quite short.
Yeah.
I'll keep this quite short. We've been looking at this concept of place health. So how do you actually use architecture, design, to create places that behave in a healthy way? And I think one of the interesting things about the city is there are different areas do talk to each other, different disciplines do talk to each other. So the forum within which that can occur, and the opportunity to actually trial and roll out live pilots, which part of the stuff we do with Stefan is around the notion of place health. How can we actually design cities that are better for our citizens?
Stefan, but at the moment you're coming out, you've got all the answers, so have you got another problem?
No, I just, maybe I'll try and summarise what I was saying earlier on, because I realised, reflected back from different people, I think we might be doing 17 things I wasn't aware of now. The place health concept is the thing that we've been working on together, so that's kind of where it's located. I'm really interested in the methodological point, because we're using design research methods to try and connect the scales. So we were working at the spatial framework level and at the community level and the very particular level, and that really is the key challenge for us, so that when you put in a piece of infrastructure or the decisions you make, it actually does improve the health of the people that live there. And so connecting those things is really key. And using the Hour Manchester as an example, there is a network being set up that's dividing the city up into an integrated set of teams that cover all of the different environmental domains and social domains and bring that together. And I think it'd be really interesting if architects and designers had a voice in that as well, rather than just being developers and planners.
Absolutely. Raphael, any thoughts?
Yeah, we've been very good at bidding and winning interesting projects, including City Verve, big project. And I think we mentioned a lot of stuff like ways of working, cultural change in terms of the way the public sector think of engaging with the community, things of design. We talk about methods, about data sets, barriers. And I just wonder if we can put a proposal together to do a very specific project that deals with a lot of the sort of questions that we have. I'm sure there's a funding agency out there, Horizon 2020 or EDK or others. Because if what we're saying is a real problem, then we should do some research on how to resolve it.
Right, so you want some proper outcomes? Ben?
Next to, I'm really fascinated by these big data ideas, but our practice is quite Luddite in comparison, I suppose. And what I'm really interested in is creating a physical space where this can all be housed. I like what you were saying at the very beginning of this discussion about Manchester being a village and feeling like a village. In some ways, I sort of think we need more than a town hall. We need like a village hall, sort of social space where people can come together, and where all of this, it needs to be a civic space, in my opinion. I'm quite excited by this idea of all of these overlapping individual pieces of data and consultation having a physical location that where anybody can access it, removing these barriers to entry for people to give their feedback on projects, not live, not at the beginning of a project or during a project, but at any point. I'm sure you can do that in the town hall, but I wouldn't know how.
They're closing it for 7 years.
yeah. Well, perhaps the Albert Square.
There is a space there, isn't there? We talked about a space at the very beginning of this, before we got rolling, which is the space that you're kind of semi in control of, I think.
Yeah.
You know, so there might be a possibility.
Let's pick it up.
Is it secret?
Pick it up.
Let's put
It's like in your great aunt, Jane, that the face-to-face interactions of how she knows everything that's going on in the community. I still think that's massively important alongside the...
people are still important.
Yeah, people are still key to
Right,
that.
I'm going to run you off now. I've got Andrew and Alistair, and then a final word from Casper. And you know I've got time for one word, but
yeah, so three quick thoughts.
Yeah.
I think this evidence aggregation, particularly citizen knowledge, is really, really interesting. I think everybody's mentioned the problems of data sharing. So having had some experience of trying to do data sharing, new models of data sharing with the health service, the key is making bold decisions about what the public interest, what the civic interest is, and not worry about professional practice. Otherwise you don't get anywhere. And I think the other thing to add to that is who has the curating function of it becomes very crucial. I think there's lots of ideas around that. I'm very excited by the idea of the building or design and use study. So science, technology, innovation studies have tried to move away from the invention bit and more into the innovation and use bit, and it's really insightful and gives you a different picture. I think that's fascinating with regard to buildings. And little. It's also, from our point of view, really interesting because we're really interested in new business models for creative practice, and that would suggest something there rather than turning you all into management consultants, which seems to be every design company's fate if they try and sell process. So process innovation, I think, is really good. And the last thing is just one thing that hasn't really come up, which is about, I think Paul mentioned it, about, you know, this idea that you go data and then you go evidence and then you go impact on policy. That doesn't work. That's wrong, certainly at national level, because it misses out the story bit in between. It's stories that shape policy. evidence is only there to back it up. So I think there's an interesting thing about creating stories with citizens, and stories as a form of co-creating stories as a form of engagement, and also as a way of influencing policy both. So there's something, don't forget the story bit.
Well,
well, I suppose finally, I mean, Ben talked about being Luddite. I think we'll talk about who's more Luddite after this. I think purely on a practical level, Casper, you mentioned this sort of open platform and network that could facilitate sort of more democratic community engagement, and I think that's really interesting. Something where you can get better consultation feedback. Definitely. Anything better than the Place Northwest comment section. Would be good. Useful.
Yeah, I think that sounds great. So, one last sentence, and then I'm actually closing this now.
Yeah, we had good stakeholder networks. We are at a moment of reshaping them. And I think there is really a good opportunity for a coordinated design community voice, which is also about connecting with all the disconnected communities.